We're going to focus on a law review article that was penned by Judge Kozinski that appears in the Georgetown Law Journal entitled Criminal Law 2.0. And here's what one reviewer wrote about the judge's article. Quote, "The piece is funny, frank, and tragic, and is crammed full of welcome resources and recommendations. This article should be required reading for law school students, judges, and prosecutors. For those of us who defend indigent folks, it is the most inspirational thing you'll read all year. Read it, enjoy it, use it, and most importantly, fight for His Honor's proposed reforms." I have read it, and I support everything in that review. The site for you is 44 Georgetown Law Journal Review, Criminal Procedure 2015. So we're going to start right off with some questions from me. And this is to all three of you. I want you all to jump in and let's have a conversation. And Professor Rizalfi, I expect you to show your wit as you routinely do.
Pressure.
All right, here we go. No pressure. All right, innocent people plead guilty all of the time. Why and what is to be done?
It was interesting to hear the perspective of conviction review addressing cases in which a defendant has had a trial and an appeal and a habeas. And I was thinking, well, what about all the innocent people who never even had a trial, who pled guilty because it was the only reasonable alternative that faced them? For 4 years, I directed the California Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice. We went all over the state holding hearings, issued a report identifying the chief causes of wrongful convictions, very many of the same causes identified in Judge Kozinski's article. And my question was, why didn't you cite us? But one of my biggest disappointments was to discover that in many cases, the mistaken eyewitness identification, the false confession, the perjured jail snitch, the faulty forensic evidence that led to the conviction of the innocent could have been exposed and corrected at trial if the defendant had been represented by competent, zealous counsel who had fully investigated and prepared the case. In our report, we expressed concern with the chronic underfunding of indigent defense services in California, the way that many counties in California contract for defense services on a flat fee basis, giving the contracting lawyer a financial incentive to plead the client guilty without even investigating the case. Since we issued that report in 2008, it's just gotten worse. As we speak, there's an ACLU lawsuit pending against Fresno County, citing data that each deputy in the public defender's office has an annual caseload of 400 felonies, or if they're handling misdemeanors, their caseload is 1,375 cases per year. Between 2008 and 2012, the Fresno County Public Defender lost half of its staff to budget cuts. So let's face it, the only way you can handle caseloads like this is to plead everyone guilty. And apparently that's how the Fresno County Board of Supervisors wants it. Again, if you're putting together a reading list of must-read articles, I would recommend that everybody read Why the Innocent Plead Guilty by retired federal judge Jed Rakoff, which appeared in the New York Review of Books for November 20th, 2014. It is available online, but let me quote just one paragraph. How prevalent is the phenomenon of innocent people pleading guilty? The few criminologists who have thus far investigated the phenomenon estimate that the overall rate for convicted felons as a whole is between 2% and 8%. The size of that range suggests the imperfection of the data, but even if we suppose it's lower, say no more than 1%, when you recall that of the 2.2 million people who are in our prisons and jails today, over 2 million are there because of a plea bargain. So then we're talking about 20,000 persons if only 1% of them were innocent people who pled guilty. Now, why do they do it? Well, Judge Rakoff identifies the two chief causes of this phenomenon. Number one is mandatory sentencing laws, which allow prosecutors to offer defendants a choice like go to trial and face a sentence of 30 years or plead guilty and take a 10-year sentence. The second cause is the inability of public defenders to investigate and fully prepare cases for trial. So put yourself in the position of an innocent defendant whose choice is plead guilty and go to prison for 10 years, or go to trial with a defense lawyer who has 399 other clients and face a sentence of 30 years. Which would you choose? I fully applaud the efforts being made to establish conviction review programs, but I really wonder whether we're barking up the wrong tree, whether all of the resources going into looking for that one case out of thousands that where a mistake was made, why don't we just give those resources to the public defender and let him investigate and give competent representation at trial, and I think we'd see a lot fewer guilty people going to prison.
So this really sounds messed up, you know? So our other panelists, any comments on Dean Ullman's response?
Well, Judge Rakoff is not retired. He is senior, but he's very active. He sits with us, and he's still very much in the game, so his comments are very timely. You know, I would add one dimension to what Jerry said, and that is there are a fair number of cases where people plead guilty because they confessed, or they are claimed to have confessed. And one of the things we find is that the number of cases where there are false confessions are actually far from trivial. People get interrogated. We forget that the IQ is sort of a bell curve, and there are a lot of people on the other side who are not that smart and not that don't have that much fortitude and can be easily sort of talked out of calling for a lawyer by police who know what they're doing. And after a few hours of grilling, they'll confess to anything. And it happens far more frequently than people want to think about. And once you have a confession, then it becomes very difficult to go to trial because juries just don't disbelieve confessions. I mean, you said, why would you say? They can't imagine. Why would you say you're guilty when you're not? And then you have the cases where there is just a claim confession. Deborah Milkey spent 23 years on death row because she spent 20 minutes in a room with a detective by the name of Soldati. They came out and she said, I said nothing, and he said that she confessed. And on that alone, she went to trial and was convicted and was put on death row and spent 23 years on death row in Arizona until a very thorough investigation by her habeas counsel went through thousands of cases where Soldati had testified and found the instances where he had been found to lie. And it was brought to us, and we found a Brady violation, and and actually set aside the conviction. It then went to the state courts on the question of whether she be retried, and the state courts barred retrial with the Arizona Court of Appeals saying, wow, this is a blemish on the reputation of Arizona as a fair place to have criminal trials. But my question is, why did federal judges have to come along and figure it out? I mean, it was all presented to the state courts to begin with, and we just went dark. Does Arizona have a lien on this place? I think once the police and prosecutors focus on somebody as the likely suspect, they get sort of tunnel vision, and they do, not always, not even, I would say, most of the time, but often enough, they do what's necessary to get the evidence to get a conviction. And once they do that, it becomes very highly irrational to not to plead guilty, even if you believe yourself innocent.
So let me just jump in. Professor Ridolfi, Dean Ullman has said that maybe we're barking up the wrong tree. You are the co-founder of the Innocence Project, and he says maybe we shouldn't be giving money to the projects like this, and let's give money to public defenders, and let's get these people out.
I think you should just ignore everything he says, frankly. No, first of all, I'm very honored to be up here with this wonderful panel. I'm really humbled by being here with two people who have done amazing work on this issue. But what comes to mind, and this isn't addressing the question that Jerry raised about resources, where we should be putting our resources, but conviction review is why we're here today. Not that long ago, I mean, for those of you who are, as I say to my students, you weren't around the dark ages like in 1989, when there was the first DNA exoneration. And at that point, if you saw, I remember the first time it was in the newspaper, and it was huge news. And no one could believe there was a wrongful conviction. Did you hear that? There was a person in prison. He was, DNA proved he was innocent, because I remember my years in the trenches as a public defender that, I couldn't convince my Uncle Nick over Thanksgiving dinner that a person was ever wrongfully convicted, because we have due process in this country. And as a result of the post-conviction review of DNA exoneration cases, we're here today. Because that review has basically opened the door or opened the window into our system so that we've been able to now identify what are the causes of wrongful conviction, and that's critically important. And I think back to the dark ages 15 years ago when Linda Starr and I started getting this program together. And I remember being interviewed by the San Francisco Chronicle, and a reporter saying to me, "Why are you doing an Innocence Project here in California? This isn't the deep, dark South. This isn't, Georgia or Oklahoma. We don't have these problems in this state." And I just thought, well, really, So, and I understand why they thought that, because we're a state that puts money into our justice system, and, we can be proud of what we have. But it's because of the wrongful convictions and what's been demonstrated by the review of these cases that we now know, and the wrongful convictions, so many of them now have been demonstrated in California. Californians can no longer say that. And I look around at this room and I think, when I walked in here, I thought to myself, my God, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have this wonderful group of people here today. And I'm very encouraged and enthusiastic about the fact that there's so many people from prosecutors' office so interested in conviction integrity units, because that's what it's going to take.
Okay.
It isn't just the South. The reality is we grow up in believing that in America, innocent people don't go to prison. We've got this great system of justice, a presumption of innocence, burden beyond a reasonable doubt. Yeah, sort of in France and in the 18th century, maybe, they would put people in prison and throw away the key, but that doesn't happen in America. The reality is really quite different. It's not like people in the South say, oh, yeah, we want to convict a bunch of innocent people. No, nobody does. Everybody in America, thinks they've got a system that is fair, and only the guilty people get put in prison. I think you know, the first step, of course, is to sort of educate people to the idea that this is really not true. I mean, we have a system that's pretty good. We have a system that's is got a number of protections, but it's also a system that fails. It fails a fair number of times, more times than I think people would be comfortable if they knew what it was. Based on this presumption that we all share, maybe not everybody in this room, but we as a society share that we've got essentially a foolproof or close to foolproof criminal system, we have built a series of procedural devices to keep convictions once they become final or once they come in from the jury, to keep convictions in place. Harmless error review doctrine on appellate review, various bars on collateral attack. Now you've got EDPA in federal court, all designed to keep in place convictions that once they've been obtained. Now, a couple of thoughts on that. This is not inevitable. Other common law countries have different systems, and I think that we're studying. In places like Canada and Australia, and I think all the common law countries other than America, they have something called a procedure for finding when a conviction has become unsafe. And I am on this discussion group with judges from all over the world, so we had a discussion about this, and I said, well, at that point, the defendant has to prove his innocence. And they said, no, not at all. Once he provides evidence that makes whatever the standard is, feel that the judges feel that the conviction is unsafe, it gets reset to the baseline, and then you look at all the evidence, including the new evidence that's been discovered. I said, well, there has to have been evidence that couldn't have been discovered. They said, not at all. If it's unsafe, we go back and take another look. Very different from our system. There's something else that's different about our system that is seldom pointed out, and that is the huge, huge disparity in incarceration rates in this country. Our incarceration rate is so far beyond the rest of the world, it is astonishing. And I am guessing even in this group, you all don't know off the top of your head what the disparities are. And I'm willing to bet that few people know outside. United States, the incarceration rate is 700 per 100,000. Now compare this to other places that are like us, that we think of like us. We think Canada is sort of like us. We think of England, Germany, France, places like that, Denmark, Holland. None of those have incarceration rates equaling 200 per 100,000. They're all in the 90 to 150, 160, and 170 range. So we have essentially 3 times, and here in the home of the brave and the land of the free, we have a incarceration rate that's triple that of more than triple, sometimes quadruple as much as other countries that are sort of equal, that are like us in every other way. We have places in this country, like Louisiana, where the incarceration rate is 1,000 per 100,000. Now think about what that means. It means that 1 out of every 100 Louisianan is in prison. 1 out of every, 1 out of every 100 Louisianan is in prison. So it's really sort of this is and the effect is this is the result of the fact that we have much heavier sentences for the same crimes as they do in other countries, and that people just wind up serving longer. They have mandatory minimums we have in this country that don't exist elsewhere. And that gives great incentives for people to plead guilty, because they are facing not a few years in prison, not 5 or 6 years in prison. They're looking at 30, 40 years in prison, maybe never ever to see the light of day. I think the fact that I don't think most people are aware of these facts, I think, is sort of a failure of our system.
I think if people read the article, you'll get even more information about that. And I'd venture to say that those who are the longest incarcerated are poor people and people of color. Judge Kaczynski said, why do we have to go all the way up to the federal courts to get all this stuff corrected? So that brings up a question, and this is really focusing on state court judges, and you know, my having been one for 20 years, I mean, I'm falling right in this thing. So can judges be trained to prevent wrongful convictions? Can they be trained to do the right thing and overturn wrongful convictions in post-conviction proceedings? And that really begs the question, can judges be trained to do anything? Your responses.
Our commission looked very closely at the role of judges in terms of enforcing Brady disclosure requirements and dealing with the rare cases of prosecutorial misconduct. And what we discovered was case after case in which misconduct was uncovered. In many cases, the court even found that it was not harmless error. And that was the end of it. The judge never carried through with the duty imposed on him by California law to report the offending prosecutor to the state bar. None of these cases had ever been reported. So I think judges tend to look at their own little world, and when they have a prosecutor who's out of line, the way to deal with the situation is call him into chambers and give him a little lecture. The problem with that is that the next judge isn't even going to know that this prosecutor ever got called out and lectured. There's no record kept of repeat misconduct. And we found a number of cases where prosecutors, the same prosecutor, had in 3 or 4 cases crossed the line and withheld Brady material or made improper arguments or whatever. If we're just relying on the judges to straighten that problem out, I think judges tend to just.
But we, you know, most judges are elected, and federal judges, you got your lifetime tenure. So federal judges, they can go and do this stuff, and I don't have to worry about getting the boot. But what about the, you know, this whole system of, you know, we're all elected, and don't we have to keep watching out, looking over our shoulders? Professor Rodolfi, what do you?
The problem is the whole system, frankly. You know, going back to the importance of conviction review tells us what's wrong. When we know what's wrong, we have to be able to see it to fix it. And I think judges have an obligation to understand what is wrong, and I think prosecutors have an obligation to be looking at all the known causes of wrongful conviction now and seeing what they can do to do things differently so that doesn't happen again.
Can you pull the mic a little closer?
Yeah, and when I talk about the system, Jerry was referring to the study that preventable error that Maurice Posley, who's in the room today, and I did together and produced a lot of very interesting information. And one of them was the fact that we identified like 600 cases of misconduct. And when we went to the state bar to see how many prosecutors had been disciplined at all for the misconduct, we found 1 in 10 years. And there had been some prosecutors who had committed misconduct again and again and again. The same kind of misconduct, 1 as many as 6 times without ever being disciplined. So there's something systemically wrong. The other piece of it was that we found that there was a Business and Professions Code rule which says that judges are required to report misconduct to the state bar when the misconduct results in a reversal of the conviction. So which brings me to another issue. The fact of the matter is that most of the time courts find misconduct and they find it harmless error. So if it's harmless error, the courts, there's no obligation to report the prosecutor. What does that tell you about the concern the system has for misconduct? It doesn't change the nature of the misconduct, it only changes the outcome in the case. That's a terribly troubling thing that we found. It also brings me to the question of appellate courts. Harmless error. Every case is not harmless error, and appellate courts need to be better about paying more attention and finding harmful error, because we need incentive in the system to do things differently. The other piece is that when I studied prosecutorial misconduct in appellate cases, what we found a very common trend in California, and now we're starting to see it elsewhere, is that reviewing courts would review the case, and if they saw misconduct, they would, before deciding whether or not the prosecutor committed misconduct, they would say, well, let's see, would it be harmful if they had? And then when they conclude, no, it would be harmless error, they don't bother opining on whether or not what the prosecutor did was wrong. And that's an important missed opportunity, because judges should be helping to remind all of us what is expected of us. And in terms of trial courts, I think trial courts could do things differently. Trial courts could do more to enforce Brady compliance. They could be issuing orders for Brady compliance, so that if a prosecutor fails to disclose evidence, that would be a violation of a court order. So and the other piece of it is that if judges are mindful and they know it when they see it, when they're in a trial and they see a snitch testify or a snitch being offered, they know to look more carefully. That's not to say that the evidence shouldn't come in, but they know to be very careful and be thoughtful about what's coming in and the value of it. It isn't prejudicial. And the same is true for mistaken identification and all the other known causes of wrongful conviction. There's a great deal of work that can be done. And I'm encouraged by what has been done. Let me give a shout out to my wonderful students in this room who are studying ethics with me, who are going to be prosecutors tomorrow. And I'm thrilled by that. John Vandekamp once said, when I said, how do you do this? This is maddening. And he said, you have to take the long view. It may feel like we're going slow, but I look at the last 15 years and I think we're really doing wonderful stuff. And I applaud the many, many prosecutors who are in this office.
We have 1 minute left, and I'm going to give that minute to Judge Kaczynski.
I want to say that
Dean Ullman.
Conviction review needs to be looked at not just as a corrective mechanism to free the innocent who are in prison, but as a reformative mechanism. When you discover that a mistake has been made, what can we do to avoid making that mistake in the future? I mean, take false confessions. Our commission recommended that all police interrogation be recorded and videotaped. I mean, we're talking about putting body cameras on police officers. Why don't we put body cameras on the detectives who do the interrogation so we can recreate what happened and see if there's a risk of a false confession?
Okay, Dean Ullman, I'm going to jump in there.
Went nowhere because of opposition of the DA's Association.
I'm going to jump in here.
And the Police Chiefs Association.
All right, thank you. And Judge Kaczynski, will you give us your final parting words? We've got 1 minute left.
Well, I agree with Dean Ullman. I think this has to be a learning experience. I think the problem with relying on judges to correct these errors is judges are subject to the same cognitive biases as juries. I talk to judges all the time and say, oh, juries always get it right. I've never disagreed with a jury. All it tells me is that they are taken in just like the jury by a lot of the things we presume about evidence, things we've been taught about how evidence works, about perception, about memory, about forensic science, and all those things go in, and people eat them up. Judges eat them up just like juries do, but it turns out that a lot of them don't work. And I thought it was a great missed opportunity that we have all these cases that in the DNA era, the ones that were tried before DNA came out, and they found DNA and they were able to go back and reconsider them. And this is just a golden opportunity to figure out which cases went wrong. And I thought those should be viewed as not sort of an annoyance, oh God, we got to let these people out of prison, but more of an opportunity to figure out what's wrong with the system, what went wrong, how did we get this so wrong that so many people are exonerated by DNA, because DNA won't come along again, something new like that can be applied to old cases, but not. But I think it has to be a learning experience, and it has to be an education experience. Judge Gertner, when she was a district judge, used to hold a lot of Daubert hearings on expert evidence, fingerprints, handwriting. None of that stuff is perfect. None of that stuff is foolproof, despite of what we all seem to believe it is.
All right, thank you. To Professor Ridolfi, Dean Ullman, Judge Kaczynski, thank you so much, and thank you for being three of our heroes. Thank you.